Well, to the latest on our electricity situation now, President Cyril Ramaphosa appearing to promise today that there will be some kind of important action or statement or announcement in regard to our power crisis in the next few weeks. Writing in his weekly newsletter this morning, he said that there's been important behind-the-scenes work around the intense load shedding that we're still suffering. The National Planning Commission and other organizations have said we should declare a state of emergency over our power crisis. Professor Dewald van Niekerk is the head of the African Center for Disaster Studies at the University of Northwest. He joins us now. Professor, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. Is there any legal basis on which government could declare a state of disaster over our power crisis?
Good afternoon, Stephen. It's a very difficult question to answer. It is not as straightforward as it seems. Within our legal environment, there's two routes to emergency law. The one is, as we would call, the state of emergency, and the other one is the state of disaster, which I think we all are quite familiar with coming out of COVID-19. But there's certain provisions within both of those pieces of legislation which governs when we can actually declare a state of emergency or a state of disaster. Now, when it comes to the State of Emergency Act, it's quite clear that the state of emergency only relates to something that has got a significant national threat to our government, be it internal or external. And a state of disaster looks at something that is beyond our ability to cope using our own resources. So currently, it is a bit of a grey area if you try to apply those legislation to something which is basically self-inflicted within government.
Also, I suppose making a legal declaration doesn't add a single megawatt to the grid. It's what you do after that really matters. I don't know if it would really help.
No, absolutely. I mean, you have to ask what the intent would be to use the Disaster Management Act or the State of Emergency Act. And if it's to mobilize certain extraordinary measures or other resource means in order to address the problem, you then need to ask now, how did this problem occur? Now, when it comes to the Disaster Management Act, we are focusing much on hazards of various kinds. And when it comes to state of emergency, as I mentioned, we are looking at external threats. So in one instance, you could probably argue that Eskom and the current power crisis constitutes a disaster, but legally it'll be very difficult in my mind to argue either of those two cases in a court of law. And I know everyone out there is extremely frustrated and fed up with the situation, but just looking at state of disaster or state of emergency, it does not 100% adhere to that definition within these two pieces of legislation. And at the end of the day, it comes down to what has the government done over the past decades in order to mitigate this problem, and it seems like not very much.
The one thing that I did think may be quite useful is that during the state of national disaster during the pandemic, and you may remember this, certain regulations around competition were suspended under the regulations. And that meant that hospitals could work together more easily and coordinate resources. And they wouldn't have been allowed to do that in normal circumstances because private hospitals are supposed to compete with each other. At the moment, there's certain regulations that certain people in the power industry say make their lives a bit more complicated. These would be around planning. These would be around, for example, local content and procurement in solar panels. The one advantage I could see, if you had a state of national disaster, is you could use that to suspend those regulations.
Yeah, sure, Stephen, you could probably, but you then find yourself in management by disaster. In other words, every time something goes wrong, we need to declare national or provincial or whatever state of disaster in order to fix the problem. And I don't think that was the intent or is the intent of the Disaster Management Act. There's certainly quite a lot that government can in any case already do that you don't need emergency law for, you don't need emergency regulations for it. It's just a plain decision that someone needs to take and implement. And it seems like our politicians find themselves in paralysis. It is well within the mandate and within the power of the President and Cabinet to do these things in any case. Nothing prohibits them from doing this. Nobody prohibits them from making a decision to say these regulations that we've put in place is absolute nonsense, so let's get rid of them. You certainly don't need to be declaring a national state of disaster for that. And that's what kind of baffles me is why do they want to use emergency law to gain extra power, which they in any case actually have? But it might seem unpopular if they just implement it as such. Therefore, we have to create this artificial disaster that we sit with. We actually don't sit with a national disaster. We just sit with national incompetence.
Are you worried that after the pandemic it's quite tempting for lots of governments anywhere to sort of rule through disaster or manage through disaster? I wonder if it's quite tempting for some people in a way.
Oh, it is. It definitely is. But what we've seen in many other countries where there's been overstepping of these powers, that there's been massive outcry by the electorate, and there's been quite a lot of the politicians that's been held account to the fact that they are overstepping the grounds when it comes to emergency law. We've seen it in South Africa as well. There's been many pressure from various groups in asking questions about having the national state of disaster, especially under COVID-19, in place for so many months, and asking questions of how government are applying the powers that this extraordinary law gives them. And we must remember at the end of the day, that is why we have emergency law, is to invoke certain extraordinary measures. And certainly Eskom and the power crisis does need extraordinary measures, but certainly not to the extent that we would be calling this a disaster in the pure form of the word. We need to be looking at what are the underlying factors that contribute to this crisis in the first place. And it's not your conventional vulnerabilities and hazards that we sit with. These are things that's way within the powers of us as human beings to solve, and within our power as a government to solve. And it's just something that they need to be doing. And I don't know what's preventing them from doing this. Maybe it's very unpopular decisions that the executive needs to make, and toes that they need to step on, and certain barriers that they need to cross in terms of labor, etc. But certainly someone needs to step up and make these very tough decisions. I think this is why we have a president, why we have cabinet. They are being paid and being held accountable by the electorate to be doing these type of things. And this is certainly what we expect. I think the disaster in this case is the fact that politicians aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing.
Professor Dewald van Niekerk, thank you, Head of the African Centre for Disaster Studies at the University of North West. I do appreciate it.